All right, we are going to get started with the next speaker. So our next speaker is Marie Richards, who is the Repatriation and Historic Preservation Specialist with the Sioux Tribe of Chippewa Indians, the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, but more accurately, the Bawating Anishinaabe. And that office, she's going to tell you basically what they do, so I'm not going to go into all of that. But she is currently working on her PhD at Michigan Tech. Again, another tech person here today. We're always happy to have tech people. It's like we need more northern people presenting next year, so we'll work on that. But we're really happy she could be here. Looking at her resume, which she didn't know I had because I found it on LinkedIn, I was just really impressed with her work and her background as a field archaeologist and ethnographer, but also that in her studies, she not only studied Michigan Tech, but also at the University of Iowa, where she got her master's in regional planning, urban and regional planning, and her bachelor's in anthropology, but also at Northwestern State University, where she studied heritage resources. So she has an amazing background, and we're very fortunate to have her in the UP and working for the Sioux Tribe. That's just fantastic. So would you please welcome Marie Richards.
Anin buju, mani geshibaba sekwe nadijnakas, minekdodam ishbaming Michigan donjaba. Thank you all for inviting me, and appreciate being in Marquette. Gichi name zibing. And so I've been the repatriation specialist for Sault Ste. Marie for 2 years now. I started during the pandemic. Always a fun time to move. I definitely do not recommend it. And so that's what I've been doing. This is a photo of some porcupine quills. We have community members who have been very active in reviving a lot of our traditional arts and everything. I just wanted to explain it before I went on. So my role as a repatriation and historic preservation specialist is to represent Sioux Tribe in talking to other places on how we preserve our culture and how we restore things. A lot of it is working with federal agencies, but I do get to have more pleasant conversations working with museums and other spaces around in order to talk about our culture and interpretation. So I'm going to focus more on tell you a little bit more about ourselves and what we've been doing in Sault Ste. Marie, in Bawating for revival or for preservation efforts, and also the fact that a lot of our preservation and on telling our stories are in spaces that we don't control anymore. And so it becomes this need for partnerships and engagement with places around us, because the representation of our communities for Anishinaabe has been outside of our control for a very long time. And so a few years ago, I was visiting a site, and they were talking about copper mining, and the tour guide said he didn't believe that Native people had done the mining. He said they were too stupid to have done that. And things like that. And then followed it up with, so I don't know why the archaeologists keep supporting it. So 2 ways that I had to be insulted. But I continued on the tour anyway because I paid money. And I also didn't feel compelled to tell the people at that time that happened, because if they're selecting tour guides who have that perspective, are they going to listen to me when I tell them what my experience was? And then last year, my supervisor and I were working with another place about interpretation. They wanted to have the tribal experience part of their story in their new facility. And so my elder was telling them about the importance of Babating as our spiritual gathering place, as the rapids, when people would come and fish, and how the locks took that away. And then the conversation of those in attendance with us switched from that somber mode to talking about how amazing the locks are and how they could build something that shows just how difficult the portaging was and how it's so much better now. And I had to look at my elder, who looked like she had just been punched in the gut. Because where the locks are was one of our villages, in which we had to be removed from there in order to build the locks. So there's a lot of misunderstandings, misrepresentation, and there's a reason why that exists. Because people are taught certain things for certain ways, for certain reasons. It was a lot easier probably for people to face our genocide by assuming that we were stupid and lazy. But it's gotten better. People are more cautious these days about misusing our heritage. In St. Ignace, people might be familiar with a campground in the 50s, 60s in which you could go see burials in the ground. Those aren't there anymore. The burials had been removed to U of M, and they have since been repatriated by Sioux tribe. But this is why we need to have partnerships in our space, because we don't have control over those spaces, but we have control and right to our cultural heritage. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sault Ste. Marie. So this year marks our 50th year of federal recognition. We have a nice little new logo for it. We are a federally recognized sovereign nation with divisions and departments mirroring those of federal and state agencies. So I work as a repatriation specialist, which is the title of our position for the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and which is the same thing as the State Historic Preservation Officer. So we have treatment as state for our own tribal lands, for preserving our heritage, in which I have to consult a lot. But then also, part of how we were able to do this is that the recognized tribes of the 1836 treaty have, and I'm gonna butcher this word like I always do, but usufruct rights, in which we still have rights to hunting, gathering, our cultural property, our cultural knowledge, even though we don't have ownership of the spaces where those happen. So our sacred sites are still our responsibility. And under those rights, we still have access to them, and we still have say to them. Including if they're burial sites in which the burials had been removed, because our ancestors still use those spaces. And you'd be surprised how common of a source of frustration that is for interpretation, to remind people that we still use those spaces. Tribal members will put out spirit plates. This is Jibai season. I shouldn't say season, but during this month is a time when we put out the spirit plates, and that has become another kind of source of things, but we still have the right to do that. So Sault Ste. Marie has a 7-county service area, pictured here in the map. So that's a map of the 1836 treaty, in which we ceded territory. Tribes before us and some of the other treaties in the Lower Peninsula were forcibly removed following the signing of our treaty, the 1836 treaty. We were also expected to move within 5 years. We didn't. We didn't. We're still here. And even in those areas when people were forcibly removed, people still remained. But the thing is, you couldn't continue being Native anymore. So one of those divisions that we have in First Sioux Tribe is the Language and Culture Division. I broke it up into the different categories. My colleagues and I work on our cultural preservation, our cultural rematriation, reactivation, all the different words that we have going on these days for cultural preservation. We do them all. We were actually very active during the pandemic with producing online content because we knew our people needed this. This is not the first pandemic that we've had to survive culturally. So within our department, we're responsible for the powwows that Sioux Tribe does, and we support the other powwows within the 7 county areas that are done by Sioux Tribe communities. Outreach and engagement, cultural education. We do a lot of different activities. Kind of the shining star, not kind of, it absolutely is the shining star of our department right now is our language revitalization efforts and preservation. We have very few fluent speakers left. A lot of our speakers that come and teach within the Upper Peninsula come from Manitoulin Island over in Canada. And so we have, for years, always offered language instructions. With the pandemic, we moved those online and started actually offering a recorded lesson every week. So those of you that use Facebook, we're on Facebook with those. We host an annual language conference, and new for us is an after-school immersion program that we were able to do due to a grant from the, I always forget what ANA stands for, ANA. So then we also have the area where I work in preservation, where I have to also, I'm our NAGPRA designee, where we go and retrieve ancestors from museums and other institutions that are federally funded. And then I also have the privilege of overseeing the Ojibwe Learning Center and Library. And then we also, our activities take place in a couple different places around Bawating and other areas within the 7 counties, but primarily out of the Naganagizik Cultural Building, the Mary Murray Cultural Camp, which is on Sugar Island, and our powwow grounds. So this is a highlight of some of the events that we have done this year, and these are just the ones that I picked flyers for. During the pandemic, we also had Coffee with an Elder, which is a weekly series in which we invited an elder or other community leader to come and speak, and we put them up on Zoom so everybody can join in. So we still had those conversations, still had those teachings going on, and other various things like that we try to do online. Our language conference is every June, in which we have various speakers and presenters talk about different aspects of culture or of language, which is another way of us teaching culture. So we focus on a couple different things in doing that, and we've been developing a hybrid version so we can have some of it available online, and we're able to do that due to a grant that I got from the Institution for Museum Library Services to create a digital archive and to build the digital means for us to be able to document our culture and provide remote access to it. But because we're able to do things together, we started doing movie nights, we started bringing in other things. We have our new cultural activities coordinator who's able to make a lot of this happen. But I want to talk about 2 projects that I've been working on with the Ojibwe Learning Center and Library, and both are possible due to grants from the Institute for Museum and Library Services. And one is the digital archive that I started mentioning, where we are making an effort to digitize our collections and make them available to tribal members remotely. And that sort of thing. So we've actually we're almost completely done digitizing a collection of beta cam videos of those kind of interviews of some elders, and hopefully we'll be able to do future elder interviews with our elders today and other community leaders. And the other project that is just really starting is a rematriating art project, in which we'll be working with community artists to develop, and community members to understand what Anishinaabe art is today. And so we have a lot of artists in our community, both traditional and news, a couple of filmmakers, like so many filmmakers these days. They're all doing wonderful work. Calvin Hartwig and Zach and Adam Khalil, to name just a few. And things like that, because we really want to know where people want to focus their art and everything. So hopefully, so then next year we'll have a series of workshops in which our community members are able to learn more about art and connect those artists with new people who want to learn. And then, so part of that is that the Language and Culture Division was formerly located downtown in the administrative building, and now we are on the reservation in Chimacua, the Big Bear Arena, for those of you familiar who are hockey people, that might be more. So this is our new location for the Ojibwe Learning Center and Library, which was finally reopened on October 21st. And this is one of our GMON. Another thing for that's going on in our community with preservation is trying to heal from the trauma of boarding schools. And this is an absolutely beautiful quilt that a community member, a survivor of the boarding schools, created out of quilt squares that people donated. They created it and submitted it to be on this quilt, and they have so many quilt squares still that, you know, trying to figure out how to show those and how to tell those stories by creating, you know, more space for that. So to go back into preservation, any and all matters of cultural preservation, repatriation, rematriation, cultural consultation, interpretation, engagement, and outreach is done through the Language and Culture Division. Sometimes we just say Language Department, sometimes we'll say Cultural Department, so it depends on who you're talking with in Sioux Tribe. A lot of my work involves the laws and regulations that impact our preservation efforts. So we have the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. It was enacted in 1978, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is how we are able to retrieve ancestors from museums, institutions. Any new projects also require NAGPRA, so when the federal government is doing things on their property, we are able to recover those ancestors, and they don't have to go into a museum. And the National Historic Preservation Act, and that's where it created our ability to have tribal historic preservation offices. That should say offices, not act. To mirror the SHPO and take responsibilities on ours. So that has led to a lot of consultation in how to protect our sites, but nothing is ever perfect. Those laws were created without really consulting our communities in the regulations and the criteria for eligibility. And that is where a lot of these conversations and why we have the need for tribal consultation for historic preservation, because the value of our sites are evaluated by non-tribal people and their understanding. And a little bit of a callback to how I already established some people's understanding of who we are. And this is a brand new bandolier bag that we just got. Someone on the West Coast emailed me and said, I have a bandolier bag, would you like it? And all she knew was Chippewa, and wasn't sure where from and everything, but it now has a home with us. And the other day I had the library open, and a little girl, probably about 9 years old, saw it and got really excited and started asking me questions. And so I was able to go and pull a book that had photos of so many more, and I was able to show her that, and that was just fantastic, because then she wanted to know how they're made and what do you use them for, and all these other cool things that come from that space. So, yeah, so going back to repatriation, I just get so excited about that bandolier bag. So repatriation is a rather, paternal viewpoint, and there was actually when when the word for when they were throwing things around, like people bring up the issue of calling it rematriation instead. But repatriation, as it's defined, is the act or process of restoring or returning someone or something to the country of origin, allegiance, or citizenship. Right? It's very kind of clinical, very cut, clean, and it's not a clean process. But what if we think of it differently as rematriation, of relearning, reactivation, returning to our sacred mother, as the restoration of the relationship of people with our ancestral lands and way of being, restoring our land, our stories, our foods, our language, restoring our landscape, returning of our Minnow Bimadazewen, our good life. And this is a Christy Bellacourt piece, and she's been amazing and prolific. But why the need for preservation, and why is it such a critical thing in our communities? Is to look at our history of dispossession, of how we were removed from those places that teach us how to be. We need the land to be Anishinaabe. We need that relationship with our land. We need that relationship with the cedar, with the water. In the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, we ceded Mackinac Island. In the 1820 treaty, we ceded more lands. In the 1836 Treaty of Washington, we ceded that big swatch I showed you earlier. But that treaty was also necessary for us to stay. That was the agreement that we could stay here, and the agreement to what we could still have access to. And some things were not prohibited by it, and we still retain those rights because they were never extinguished, which includes the right to hunt and gather, the right to our cultural spaces. And what's interesting is that we had the right to those spaces. We have the right to hunt and gather, and everything was outlined. Under Article 13, the Indians stipulate for the right of hunting in the land ceded with the other usual privileges of occupancy until the land is required for settlement. So how are we defining settlement? Until needed for settlement. So when we tell the stories about the mines, about the lumber, and going back to how my elder, how she looked, when everybody got really excited about how the locks made everything better, and which it did for shipping, it did make things better. It did make mining better. But at times when we celebrate those, Native peoples in the audience are reminded of another painful lesson, where we're reminded that these are spaces that we lost. We lost the ability to go and have sugar camps where we could. We lost the ability to have our villages where we could, where we were at. It wasn't a matter of, oh, that village is there, we'll work around it. We were moved. We were told we couldn't have those sugar bushes anymore. I included this from a Grand Land Office from the Bureau of Land Management, has these maps available online to just illustrate kind of how the landscape was changed and the perception of our cultural landscape, where here we have, this is in the bottom corner, so this is the township and range that includes Ishpeming. Here we have a Indian sugar camp, our sugar bush listed there, and the surveyor, iron. So that's part of the story is, what that means. And so much of the storying is that we just stop. We stop being. And that's far from true. So these are the ways that in which settlement is defined, in which we lost the ability to continue to hunt in those lands. And a lot of those lands, especially the timberlands, reverted back to government after people stopped paying property taxes and stuff. But that's not what this is about. I'm just going to highlight some more ways in which our cultural preservation has become such an urgent and critical and endangered matter, where Native Americans could not be U.S. citizens without giving up tribal identities until 1928. Native Americans could not openly practice cultural and spiritual beliefs without penalty until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978. So that's 50 years of being a US citizen without having your First Amendment right. People were punished for speaking indigenous language, for spiritual practices. Powwows were illegal until the 1970s. That's why we celebrate them so much, because we get to be out, we get to be visible, we get to be loud. We get to sound those drums, and we get to come home. And the final big thing that made us have this cultural preservation and continuity problem is the boarding schools. We lost children, we lost knowledge. Children weren't allowed to learn the language in their homes even for fear of your child being picked up and brought to the boarding school. There are stories of when mothers die from families, the fathers are told that they can't take care of their children, they'll be better off at school. But they weren't schooling us for the sake of education. They were schooling us to remove the Indianness. And ultimately, the way that we were removed from our culture was the physical removal from space. So I was just highlighting this. You know, these are rather famous images, and on my opening slide, while we were waiting, I had a colorized version of fishing on the rapids. So this is a rather famous one of shooting in the rapids, and that's looking at the Canadian side from the U.S. Pretty powerful and pretty impressive. But if you're looking at these maps, you can see a lot of things, and they're not sorry for the quality on this screen. They're much better when you look them online. There are a lot of islands around Sugar Island that were destroyed in order to make the shipping channel. We have that village site there, and I highlighted with a Sanborn map from 1897. Just to kind of show the contrast and how quickly that went, where these maps were drawn in the 1840s, and here you have both of those locks in 1897 on that Sanborn. Here's more of a focus of the village that we had at Bawating, in which the area circled in red is where the village is, and when you look at the image for yourself, it says reserved for Indians, or Indian reservation. And further down the road is a burial site. It's Brady Park. It's where Fort Brady was built and established right on top of our cemetery. And it's not the greatest photo of it, but you can see the obelisk in the circled area in this bottom corner here, where that burial mound is in relation to the construction of different phases of in Fort Brady of the Locks complex, in which they literally scooped out the burial mound. So that's one sacred site that we lost, but that we still remember. Families went from there to Bay Mills, to Sugar Island. I finally recently learned, I was wondering why one of my family histories was like such a cool one of those things. My family was part of that band that had to be forced out of Bawating to Sugar Island, to Garden River, to Botswana. We just fled. So our other remaining site, well, we have remaining sites everywhere. We still, even if burials aren't there, it is still sacred. It is still sacred. It is still part of us. This is part of the difficulty in doing cultural preservation, is there are so many different things that we all have to do, but I work with an absolutely wonderful team of people who specialize in things like doing ceremony, who do amazing work with the language. I gotta give a shout out to Gray Shea for their amazing work in facilitating so much of the language in our department. So Mackinac Straits is part of our creation story. This is where the Anishinaabe were created. This is our home. And there's stories of the migration east, and there's a story of migrations west. People are probably familiar with the Medewin migration story, the story of that lodge. But the Anishinaabe have been here since time immemorial. We have stories about the Great Flood, the end of glaciation. We come here, we traded here. There's so many groups. If they're Anishinaabe, if they speak an Anishinaabe Moan language, if they're related to us, to Algonquins in any way, they came through these straits at one point or another. So other nations, including the Miami Nation, Potawatomi, Delaware, all those folks, they have ties back to here too. We have along the entire way, just when you look at the straits, you can see its sacredness in the cedar that grows there. You can see its sacredness in the fisheries that are there. And we need that space to continue being Anishinaabe, because this is a space where we can be Anishinaabe. So, sorry to kind of bum people out. It's really hard to be Native and not acknowledge that. And I think that is the hardest thing for people, is to acknowledge that things happen and how do we move on. And so our preservation efforts are how we move on, because we still have the language, we still have the stories, we still have access to these lands. And a lot of that is because we have some partnerships coming along the way. Federal agencies, state government, local government, non-governmental organizations, and the like, to do really cultural restoration, restoring us into our landscape. I'm very excited about things going on with the Straits, with the DNR, the state park system. The tribe has a partnership with them and working within that, so we are able to tell our story within that space. Recently in May, the Field Museum opened its new exhibition hall, Native Truths. An elder, Cecil Pavlot, named in that right there, and I collaborated with the exhibition team that was responsible for telling the story of repatriation. And I really have to respect how they gave us the space we needed to tell that story. Because it is a hard story. But they don't always have to be hard stories. We like to laugh, we like to sing. If you've been to a powwow, you definitely know we like to laugh and sing. Oh my gosh. You know there's an auntie around when you hear a booming laugh that is louder than the drum. But, so we're developing our own space for telling our story on the reservation, so people can come in and join us. A different angle of that same Jimon I showed earlier. The ability to showcase and display who we are so people can see it is amazing, because we have really old objects in there, and this Jimon is only 20, 30 years old. Like, we're still making them. And there's been a lot of interest in that Jimon. I'm trying to, I forgot. So really, it's one of these things where people really want to help us tell our story, or they want to tell our story in their space without asking us. How do you tell your story? What story do you want told? And I think some of that stems still from this historical lie that we're stupid and helpless. that's because they took knowledge away from us in order to live in these spaces. So some people take it upon themselves to tell our story for us because we can't do it ourselves, and that is the furthest thing from the truth. And I am very open to conversations, and so tribal members. Like, we really want to tell our story. We really want to see our art. The response I got from community members about the upcoming art project was phenomenal. I hope they keep that energy. People always get excited at the beginning, and then they kind of, but I hope you all stay in that energy for those of you who are watching from home. So yeah, please continue to reach out and include us in those stories of those landscapes. Just be mindful of the price we paid for that, and everything. So, you know, a lot of interest in talking with us, and talking to tribal members and in tribal spaces is wonderful. We have so many tribal members who are doing just amazing works, all sorts of places, telling stories here, telling stories there. Community members operate the Ojibwa Museum in St. Ignace, but that is not a Sioux tribe affiliated. It just happens to be that Sioux tribe members are there, but it is not an institution of the Sioux tribe. So that's my caution, is that it's great, but it's not talking to the tribe. So if you want to say something like, we talked and worked with Sioux tribe, you have to go talk to our government. You have to. Because otherwise we're repeating that who controls the narrative. And identity is a critical part of our nation building. So I want to part with some thoughts about sacred spaces, because it is a very difficult thing to articulate. Any place we culturally value as sacred is not because we assigned it sacredness. It is Anishinaabeg, recognizing a space or being of its own inherent nature. We are drawn to its presence. We live there, we pray there, we play there. We gather our food, we collect our medicines, we visit. We live Minnow Bimada Zewen, because these spaces share with us that which cannot be described in English, but for which we assign the word sacred. Because I think that's a critical difference in a Western worldview and an Anishinaabe worldview, of that in a Western sense, you ascribe something its sacredness, you ascribe it its value. And you can desanctify that. You can take that away. I think that's the hardest thing with burials and our spiritual sites, is that they took that away. So somehow it's still not, they took that designation away. We did not take that designation away. It is still sacred. So, Miigwech, thank you all so much. Thank you, Northern, Sioux Tribe Language and Culture Division. Sioux Tribe, my colleagues at the various federal, state, and tribal levels who've worked with me on partnering on how we tell our stories better, of how we preserve our sites. I realize the relationship I have now with those agencies and with people in the Heritage Network who actually want to do right and include us. Were hard lessons probably learned over the last 30 years. And I want to acknowledge that that a lot of you have been beat up, and it shows that you listened when you include us into spaces like this today. And Chimagwich for everyone coming and listening. If you need to contact me with any questions or anything, feel free. Oh, I forgot one other thing that was really cool that we did that I want to highlight. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Department of Interior's derogatory place names replacement. A couple of you? Awesome, awesome. Well, this year they replaced across the board unilaterally, there was no exceptions. Any place name on federal lands that is named Squaw has been removed, and Sioux Tribe recommended 12 names for in those 7 counties, and all of our names were accepted. So a lot of them, they're no longer Squaw, a lot of them are Minokway and Nokomis and all that. And it's been really hard explaining to people just how bad that word is. And so So it's all not bad. We have some good things that we've been able to do and highlight, but we literally changed the map this year. And for this year, that is the biggest source of pride. Sorry.
Thank you, Maria. Wow. So, Russ, you have a question?
Say, I have a question. Is any of this information being put online so that non-tribal members can learn and know what's going on, what's happening, and so on?
Which information?
Information about the tribe, what you're doing, what you're presenting, for instance, today. I know I was the acquisitions editor for Discovering the Peoples of Michigan that MSU Press put out, and I spent years trying to get Native people to write about the story, and we never got the story. New editor came in, and the series is gone. And so I don't know, that it becomes important because you're talking about people being white people being educated,
Right.
and so on, to the Indian story, but it sounds like you're just presenting the material to the tribe. And I'm asking, does it go beyond that? Do you have stuff that goes beyond that?
Yep. We are working on things that go beyond the tribe. Sioux Tribe has 45,000 members, citizens. Mostly in Michigan, but all across the U.S. and some other parts of the world. So a lot of our stuff does have to go online, and that is freely available to anyone who has an interest, because that also means our people get access to it. One of the hard things, at least before, with being able to tell that story or share that story is who controls publishing. So when people approach us or decide to publish things, who are they talking to? Who are they reaching out to? How are they treating that person that they're talking to? And there's a lot of tribal citizens who want to tell their story, but might not feel comfortable writing about it. One project when I was working as an ethnographer in Louisiana, I was down one bayou, and a community member there, a non-native community member, she's Cajun, said, we have a lot of stories and we like to write them down, but people don't listen to the story because they're nitpicking how we spelled it. Like, our grammar's not good enough, so they're not going to read it. They ridicule us instead of facing the story of our bayous are disappearing. So that's a big thing, is that in order to tell our story, we have to continue to assimilate in order for people to understand and to hear that story, where we don't have control necessarily to whether or not a publisher is interested. We live in an era now where you have desktop printing and small publishing, and you can get that out there. That's part of the amazing, just almost like Renaissance again, where we had in the 70s and 80s, like this just huge, highly visible nativeness, because we could finally be native and not go to jail or be institutionalized for it. So now we're like in this other newer kind of renaissance of expressing our culture because of social media. That's a big thing. Our kids love TikTok, all those places, and there are people putting out their stories in that way versus writing. And so I think that's one way that there actually are individuals, and this is why it's important to include individuals and have conversations with individuals, because that's their story. They own that story. But there are other things that Sioux Tribe that we're working on. Part of what I would hope someday comes out of our digital archive collection is to be able to have an online presence like any other kind of learning institution, with an online museum that's culturally appropriate. So obviously there won't be everything up on there, sort of a thing, but that's a long process, and that's where partnerships really come in, is because we all live in a time now where everybody's understaffed and overworked, and our tribes are no exception. I think that's why in our department I focus on pretty much those laws and running the Learning Center, because we don't want to use the word museum because that locks us into a past context. but somebody else in my office, they have to do these completely different things. And we're very fortunate we're fully staffed now, but for the past year, it's been 3 of us running that entire department. So our language stuff is available online. Our language classes have remained online even though we've returned to being in person for pretty much everything when we have our ceremonies and everything else that's available. So those are up, and I encourage people to learn because it never should have gone away. It should be a language that we're definitely, like, should have been the first language and English the second, but we're at a time now where we're happy that's at least the second, and that people are trying. I will never be fluent in my life in it. But I encourage other people, and there's differences of opinions on it, but I think the more we normalize and accept our narrative and not the narrative that makes people comfortable forgetting us, I think that includes, non-native people learning, but not doing it for us, but giving us the space, working with us to have the space. I've spent a lot of time being educated to get to where I'm at in order to be respected when I go into so that when I sit down at that table, like, I can wave that same degree and people's like, oh, you have that, I have that too. You have to listen to me now because you can't use that as an excuse to not listen to me. People still think that. Like my peers in repatriation, it does kind of get that thing of, well, what do the tribes know? We still have to deal with that. So I think that's the big thing, is just like being supportive and understanding that when it comes to publishing, it's not what others want, it's what we want to put out there. But some people are that it should just be put out to Native people. Other people need to hear this story too. So I hope that helps answer.
Do we have another question for Marie?
Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation. A question I have is, how much resistance are you sensing in non-native communities to renaming and changing? We see that nationally with, the teaching of slavery and so on. There's a blowback that you can't teach that in the schools and, blah, blah, blah in certain areas. Are you sensing any of that in terms of telling your story, about how you were treated and lands were taken and just your whole history? Are you feeling any of that same kind of blowback?
Every day. For specifically for the name replacement, I didn't look at social media comments deliberately. I refused to, because the temptation to yell at people on social media was too high, and I actually really enjoy keeping my job. But there is that resistance, and that's part of, with that particular word, having to explain to people, well, I don't think anything bad of it. And the thing is, too, is that word isn't ours. Like, it is brought in here as that derogatory sense because that's the issue they're having on the East Coast, where that word is from their language. What does that mean that that word was stolen too and turned into this word? Locally too, SQ could be a bastardization of Misquabic, I've heard too. So there's some of those things where, like, part of renaming the landscape is that we don't necessarily know what those original place names are. So there's more work to be done. When I started on that, it was actually this whole, well, we need longer in order to work on this and recover the original names. But the government was, nope, this is the deadline, boom. But you guys can apply to do it in the future. So a lot of it is people just don't understand that word. And I once was dating somebody who referred to me, he goes, yeah, you're my squaw. I wasn't dating him after that. That's how that word is used, and so its replacement, I don't care if people don't like it. I don't care. Because they could have named it something else. They could have gone Hunter's Point, Sturgeon, but that would have been erasing us out of the landscape more, which then leads to an awkward, like, well, at least we're still in it if we keep it, sort of thing. So I just really ignore people who want to get mad at me that those place names changed across the board in the US. It's just like kind of like, well, how did that feel because you guys changed the names first? So I hope that answers.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Hi, I would understand that the Anishinaabe people pass down native skills like beading, weaving, whatever. Is there any avenue for non-tribal people to learn those skills? I mean, that might be really reaching because you're trying to keep your own people knowledgeable.
Yeah, that's where it does get difficult for things. I don't police tribal citizens in who they teach those to because that's not my job as the government to tell people what to do. So a lot of that is dependent on individuals who do it, but then the issue becomes that line of appreciation versus appropriation, in which some people misuse that. The fact that we weren't allowed to do it, but then people celebrate, the whiteness of doing it, for lack of a better sort of thing. So it really depends on who you ask. There's a lot of variation, and I respect other people's decisions of like keeping things. But people do get picky about who they teach. I worked with a basket maker in Louisiana. He was taught by the last Choctaw of Bayou Lacombe how to make baskets, and he was taught by that woman with the promise that he would teach others. Now, he himself is not Choctaw, but he only teaches Choctaws to make baskets. And he even reminded me, I was documenting him making baskets for the tribe I was working for. And he said, I'm not going to teach you. And I said, I respect you too much to ask. So it really is up to the individual, and there is a lot of things, but that also comes into the whole, just because one of us said it's okay does not mean everybody thinks it's okay. Like, look at what's going on with the mascot issue, sort of thing. And again, that's that difference between people and the government. So our tribal governments have positions on things. But yeah. Yeah.
All right, folks, thank you. Marie, this was fantastic, and thank you so much for coming and speaking today. And just thank you so much. So let's have a
Thank you for listening.
Megwatch.
All right, at 1:45, we'll start with our next presentation, so you have a little bit of time if you need to use the restrooms or get something to drink. 7 minutes. You have 7 minutes. We're on target, man.